Hi, everybody.
Unmuted.
Glad you're here tonight. Hope you're ready to talk about a lot of very fun, but also serious, topics. We're probably going to range over a wide array. General content warning. I figure most of the listeners know, since this is a panel about trauma and healing in fiction, some of what we talk about might be a little intense. So we just want to put that out there to start. But now to get around to the intros. So first off, I would like everybody to go around, introduce yourself, give a quick rundown on what your either just came out or upcoming book is about, how you see that connecting to the panel topic. Go wild. So Kerstin, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kerstin Hall. I am joining you at 1:30 in the morning from Cape Town. So if I say anything stupid, we're going to 100% blame it on that. So I wrote a novella that came out with Tor.com Publishing called The Border Keeper, which came out in 2019. Which is about a man traveling through the land of the dead with the help of a very grumpy psychopomp witch. And then in June, my debut novel was coming out, and that's called Star Eater, and it's about a cannibal priestess in a matriarchal order who really doesn't want to be a cannibal priestess in a matriarchal order. So dealing with that. I'm also an editorial assistant at Beneath Ceaseless Skies magazine. So that's me.
Well, I'm above you, so at least for me. Hi, we already got such wonderful introductions, but my most recent novel is, gosh, I should have held it in my hands, but look, it's right on my bookshelf. I didn't knock anything down. Is First Become Ashes, and this came out on 4/6 very recently. It is about, thank you, the undoing of a cult from 4 points of view. And it deals with magic and conditioning and grief and abuse. And I'm really excited to be talking with these folks here tonight about, digging into some of these topics.
I'll go. It's me. So I'm super excited to be here tonight. I'm Anita Kopacz, and I'm the author of Shallow Waters, which comes out August 3rd. And Shallow Waters is about Yemeya, who is a Black mermaid. And I imagined her before she knew she was a goddess. And she is an Orisha from the Yoruba people in Nigeria. And so it takes place in the early 1800s, and she's a Black mermaid. Starts off in Africa. They come to the New World, and she turns into a human. So most of the book is about her trying to navigate and find her love during a time where her skin color makes her a slave. So there's a lot of magic and trauma happening in there.
Feels like quite a theme. What a coincidence that we're all here to.
Yeah. I also did the put it on the bookshelf. So Summer Suns, as was mentioned in the intro, is coming out, I think the latest of all of us, on September 28th. It's a contemporary Southern Gothic about gay codependency and what happens when you lose someone who you thought you never would, and how you make a life after that, or if you can. And the legacies of trauma in the South and history, because it's a Gothic, so you have to. There's ghosts. All right. And that leads us, I think, into the next question, which is more about the title of the panel. So given that this is about trauma and healing through magic and speculative fiction, how do you see the imaginative or even the weird or the speculative working in your fiction to help you deal with these topics? Like, what are the tools you get to use in speculative work that you think help with this?
I'll go.
Yeah.
So, wow, I would say that I'm just thinking of how storytellers in ancient times were considered shamans, and that their stories were given to them to heal the people. And so having, like, I feel like that was definitely the process for me in writing the book. Like, even the process of writing the book, mad traumas were coming up, and like, it's like, okay, let me write. I'm like writing about the experience of the enslaved Africans on the Middle Passage, and I like can write a little bit, then I'm like crying on the floor, like, oh God, what am I doing? And what was really awesome about this panel is that before we came on, we were asked, do we have any triggers? And, like, what can we stay away from? Well, I'm like, I do have a trigger. That's being like the only Black person on a panel with all white people when all of this crazy stuff is happening around the world, right? But I'm like, I'm diving in because that's what my book is about, right? Because we want to get to the healing of all of that. And how do we do that? Like, how do we do that? I don't know if I'm not going to cuss just in case I can't, but how do we do that? And so, I would, for me, some of the tools that I used within within the book were were just connecting with the ancestors and having the ancestors sending messages, because they were doing it in real life, so I have them doing it within the book.
Wow, that was a great answer. Thank you for starting us. And I've been told we can cuss, so yeah. So let's see. It's interesting because this is like sort of an overlap of craft and also like the personal. So when I think about when I was younger, and as I've grown and through lots of the different challenging times in my life, I have sought my refuge in magic, in the fantasy genre. And that's actually something that I gave to one of my characters. So it's about a cult that is liberated against their will at the beginning. And the cultists are raised to believe that they can do magic. Some of them can do magic, and they're going to fight monsters. And there is a sexy cosplayer who meets up with one of the believers and goes on his quest with him. And that cosplayer is in a place where he has turned to this his whole life, and is now facing it in reality. And I think about all the times that I have turned to fantasy and how I've wished, if only I had magic, if only I could XYZ, if only I could go to this other place, or there was a portal. But just like when a character sort of confronted with that in reality, it doesn't solve the problems. Having magic doesn't create the healing necessarily. Like, that's inside. And it's just interesting how we view this thing as very cool and fun and like lots of fantasy fiction, but it comes with it comes for the cultist, it comes with years of abuse, physical and mental. And the cosplayer was turned to it after having grown up in a place that where he was not allowed to define himself. And so, now they're amidst all this magic and monsters, but it is terrifying and lives are at stake and there's a lot of hurt and pain. So you know, for me, the magic was sort of exposed as not all that glitters is gold, and trying to find that healing sort of outside of it.
Okay, it's quite hard to follow on when other people give really good answers, and I'm just like, okay, my turn. So for me, in Star Eater, I use the tool of weirdness quite extensively, and it mostly comes out through the visions that the protagonist has, which kind of take the form of very malicious nightmares that materially affect her. And these are sort of like a magical phenomena that she's trying quite hard to keep secret from the order that she's a part of, because there's quite a lot of stigma against people with mental health issues in her particular order. So it would not be in her interest if anyone really found out she was being haunted in this way. So those visions allowed me to use very weird imagery to directly sort of no, I've lost the word, but to make a repressed trauma something very obvious. So she's got considerable anxieties about pregnancy and motherhood. So in a normal book, you couldn't just like send a creepy floating embryo like past her and be like, oh, what a strange metaphor is going on here. But fantasy gives you those tools. So that's kind of how I was using it extensively to talk about her repressed traumas in a very direct way, but like hiding it. So that's me.
I love that. And I feel like that's something that like all of us sort of have said now that we are like working in, where you can really like literalize a lot of the stuff.
Yeah.
Show it.
That was the word I was looking for.
Yeah. Well, it just popped into my head like magic. So what can I say?
Yeah, I think that was something in looking over everyone's books before this that was a shared thematic, I think, was like, this is metaphor, but it's more than metaphor. Like we are making this very real in that sense to grasp it in a very different way. And that actually, particularly Anita, to your answer, going into our next question, I was thinking, so I'm going to give credit where credit is due. I'm kind of stealing this from a panel that was done at Yale in 2019 on writing trauma. You can find it on YouTube. It's very good. Like Dr. Roxanne Gay's in it, phenomenal. And one of the things they talked about in that panel was, how do you write about trauma in these ways without cannibalizing yourself or your experience or the experience of your marginalized group, et cetera, in these social ways? Like, how do you do that in a way that's not damaging? And particularly with publishing and how visible it is to be someone publishing about topics like this, what do you guys feel about that? How do you work through that process?
Well, I could go.
So, please do.
I'll go. I mean, it's hard, right? Like, how do you do that? And to me, I can't worry about that, right? Like I have to allow whatever's coming through, like a channel, however it's coming through. And you know, for me, it seems like there's a bit of just as a Black woman, I'm writing about the Black experience, so it's like I feel free in expressing, you know, that part. But I did have, you know, I have a whole bunch of different types of people represented within the book, you know, so I did have to be very mindful about that. You know, there's indigenous, there are LGBTQ plus, there's like so many things within the book that I'm like, with a lot of trauma that I'm just like, how
Yeah.
I don't know how to, like I just had to do it, right? It's like one of those things where it's in my soul. I just have to do it and not worry about that.
Wow, I think that's really, I tend to hate when people are like, that's so brave. But like, I feel like when you're like an author or like somebody who's creating art to like put so much of yourself into something is really hard. I consider myself a pretty open person. And, if you get me at a convention hotel bar and we're chatting, like I would love to open up so much of myself to you. I love discussing intimate details of my life with people, but do it to immortalize it in this way and to know that you're going to be asked questions about it. And that's totally different, I found, which I didn't expect going in because I've always felt, oh, I'm such an open book, whatever. There are parts of myself that I've decided I'm happy to talk about, in interviews and on panels. And then there are parts of myself that I put into my fiction. And nobody has to know how much of that is true, how much of that is not true. And that's the thing about, I think also harkening back to the last question about like speculative fiction is it takes it a step further away from us. It's not, it doesn't feel like totally grounded, modern, contemporary fiction where it's like, is the author? This is definitely not me. I cannot do magic. I will not be fighting any monsters. But that doesn't mean I don't share aspects of myself with all of my different characters, no matter how different we are. So, I definitely take very specific instances from my life, but um, I I fictionalize them in ways that feel cathartic to me, but aren't necessarily, things that might happen that aren't contemporary, that aren't in my life. This is how it could have been if I had magic powers and was like going to do a quest to fight a monster. And so, it's tricky because, you don't want to give, I say you, I mean me, everyone's different. I don't want to give all of myself to strangers because I've seen what it's like I've felt that pushback, and it's very hurtful a lot of the time. So but there is a lot of me in my work, and how much and what parts, that's for me to know and for everyone else to simply enjoy the ride.
I just like what Kellen said, it really makes a lot of sense to me, and I don't think I have anything more to really add to that question. So I'm going to take a pass on this one. But I agree with what has already been said. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think there's something to what we're all hinting at about publishing being a field that expects you to give a lot of yourself in the act of representation of things also. That no matter what kind of story you're telling, like you did it and people are going to wonder why you chose that thing. It reminds me of the Alexander Chee's really good essay collection that I suddenly can't remember the title of. It's got a red cover.
Biographical novel?
Yes, there we go. Thank you. I didn't prepare that ahead of time. So next question a little bit. I wanted to ask back around to the magic parts. And I know we were saying, maybe Kellen, you can't do magic and fight monsters. Who knows? We can't be sure. And also to your point about like ancestral magic and that sort of thing. Like, how do you think about magic in your work, but also your life, however you want to go with it? What does that mean to you? I feel like all these books have very alchemical like processes around trauma, that something happens and it forges something. So what do you feel about that in your work?
I don't know, but I'm ready for Anita because she's like snapping and oh, and I guess I was attempting to do a pass along to you, and you're looking at me like, all right.
I was like, go ahead. Yes. So I am absolutely magical. I always have been. I guess, you know, people might have called it weird or whatever it was. I've always been extremely strange my whole fucking life, right? And so, but luckily, I've been blessed to be supported within that, right? Like everyone would just be like, oh yeah, that's Anita, right? Like if I was doing things, I was obsessed with death when I was younger. Like I was like, Mom, we all get to do it. And it's the most amazing thing we're ever gonna do in our life. And everyone would be like, oh God, Anita, just don't say that, you know, when the guests come, right? Like, and I saw ghosts and everything, all of that. And when I turned 18, I started hearing voices. And I was like, oh, fuck, I'm crazy, right? Like is this really what the story's gonna be? Shit. And I realized I was at UC Berkeley. I was walking to school and I was hearing voices. And then I realized that the voices would get louder as I was passing people, right? And I'm like, oh, fuck, am I hearing people's thoughts? And I would cross and then it would get louder. And it was none of the thoughts were good thoughts, very bad thoughts. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I get to class, I hear someone crying, I like look behind me, nobody's crying. Then I get that they're crying because something happened to them 3 days ago. So I was like, look, I know something happened to you 3 days ago, but you're gonna be okay. And she like, her eyes like got big. What I didn't know was that her girlfriend had just cheated on her 3 days ago. And that's what, you know, I didn't get all the information, right? I just got something happened to them 3 days ago. Right. So I leave because it was too much. I get home and one of my sister's friends was in front of the house and he was saying something and all I could hear was, I don't know where my wife and kids are. And I was like, I know you don't know where your wife and kids are. And he almost attacked me, right? Like grabbed me. He's like, where are they? And I was like, I don't know. You just said you don't know where they are. And he's like, I didn't say that, right? And he's like, I wasn't saying that. That did not come out of my mouth. And I was like, yeah, but I heard you. And so it was extremely traumatic to use my magic, right? Like, and so I ran upstairs, I like prayed to God. I was like, Goddess, universe, whatever it is, like, take this away from me. If this is supposed to be a gift, I don't want it. Definitely don't want to be reading people's minds. That wouldn't be, I'd choose to fly. Like if I could choose something, right? Like not to read people's minds. And so I did ask for it to come in a way that I can handle it. And so I had a dream that I was throwing stones and doing readings for people. So that's how I started doing readings and being within or just allowing myself to be within the magical realm. So yes, it's a lot of it has to do with my life.
I was going to say, I'm so glad to have met you now, but I'm so sad that I did not know little Anita because you sound like the coolest child. I was not obsessed with death as a child, but I was reading all of my mother's Michael Crichton novels and the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice way before I should have been reading those. And there was some gay shit in there. And that was very exciting for me, a person who did not know what's happening. So when I was sort of crafting the magic system in my book, I think as a writer, I like to know what's going on, even if it's not always clear, to the reader. So for example, part of the book focuses on whether or not magic is real because Lark, who is one of these chosen anointed ones within the cult, has been raised to believe that he can do magic, and he still thinks he can do magic, and everyone's like, you can't do magic, it's not real. He's like, but I know I can, and I can feel it, and I can see it. And he performs magic throughout the book. And my editor and I had a phone call, and he was like, okay, so when this happens and that happens, this kind of spell happens. When this happens and this happens, this kind of spell happens. And I was like, that's not how magic works in this book. Like, it's not a formula. It really depends on whose point of view we're in and whether or not they believe. Because Lark, for example, there might be a scene where Lark performs healing magic on himself in front of his new cosplayer friend who badly wants to believe in magic his whole life and has been a seeker, basically. And so that looks one way to Lark, and it looks a slightly different way to his new friend, and it looks totally different to the onlookers. But you are reading from the point of view of the friend, so you're going to see him unsure of what he's seeing and struggling with his belief. And this sort of, I think, maps onto the greater notion of like spirituality and religion and our varying metaphysical beliefs that like different people have. What's true for you, and like what manifests and what works is going to be not necessarily how other people see it working. And you really, for me, a lot of it was about anchoring that magic in the belief for the people who had it. I really hate when books, I always remember, I didn't read this, but I remember watching Bridge to Terabithia as a child. And at the end, it was like Terabithia was just a cardboard box in the woods or whatever. And I was like, what? All that, and it wasn't real. Like, and I just refused to take that away from my characters. I think that like forcing it to all be a massive coping mechanism sort of robs them of something. And I didn't want to rob that from my characters. So that's why it's sort of intentionally muddled in my book. That was really important to me.
I love that.
Okay. No, you go. No. The muting and unmuting situation, I'm like, is it whose turn?
You don't really have to mute yourself. It's just, I thought I was echoing for like 10 seconds once, so.
Okay. In my book, magic is definitely not all that fun. It's not like people throwing fireballs around or waving wands. Like it's not really a good time. So I was really hoping that my book would sort of function as something of a critique of fantasy's obsession with inherited power and like hereditary magic, like sort of interrogating the costs of that. So it contains quite ugly things about motherhood and duty and obligation and navigating that. And I wanted to really interrogate the costs of power in this book. So that's kind of what I was going with my magic system. I wanted to take the idea of inherited magic and like contrast that with the idea of inherited trauma. So generations of women who've been forced to do really very unpleasant things to one another in service of their community. So how far does duty towards the care of your community extend? If your society will be obliterated if you stop doing these terrible things, can you justify stopping? So yeah, like my magic's a bit gnarly.
You know what this reminds me of? I never forget this, and I definitely utilize this in my writing. In The Handmaid's Tale, I think it's part of the epilogue where one of the people who's like in charge, or they're recounting a man's point of view, and he says something like, we put the women in charge of each other, in order to like keep them in line, basically. And like just sort of what you mentioned about like having people inflict trauma on each other sometimes as part of like a mutually terrible, harmful situation. Like that's a thing I 100% intentionally did in First Become Ashes. The magic that they perform is actually pain fueled. It's fueled by physical pain. And so the the chosen ones are paired and they hurt each other. The leader of the cult, her hands are clean. She is not technically, in that system, but she is having people hurt each other, so I think that's tricky because we often think of that sort of harm as coming top down, and it does, in a different way when you're setting people up to hurt each other.
Yeah, for sure. Like looking at lateral trauma also, not just the big system. Also, I'm still the cannibal witches is a lot, and it's great. Like there are very different forms of magic in each one of these texts. Yours is the one that's most intriguing and that I would least like to encounter. Like
it's not a world you want to spend any time in.
Yeah, but to Kellen's point there at the end, that draws me to another question. That's could be a craft one, could be a personal one, however you want to take it. So I'm thinking about when we write trauma, there's feeling involved and you're feeling it. It's in the text, you're making the audience feel it. And I think that's something that I'm really curious how you thought about that process of like feeling trauma. Did you have artistic or even ethical concerns or parameters in what you show on the page or what you don't, or what you didn't want to do or did want to do to the audience?
Anita, you're up to bat. We've got an order now and it's just flowing.
It does seem like there's an order, but I'm like, am I totally like just like coming in every time, right? Okay, but we'll say it's the order. So yes, like I was saying before, I definitely was feeling the trauma as I was writing it, as I was feeling it come through. And it's interesting because most of my work that I do with people is healing sexual trauma, and I didn't bring it into this book because I feel like every single book, every single movie, everything that I've seen about a woman in slavery, she was brutally raped. And I purposefully didn't bring that into this story. Could have taken it to a whole nother level. It could have, but it also was not needed with all of the other trauma but there are many different things that that I went through as I was writing the trauma. And I feel like for me, my book, this one in particular, this book is it's like a personified account of my ancestral healing. Like I was going from different, like my ancestry comes from both sides. My dad is Polish, white. My mom is Black, Caribbean, and then originally Nigeria. And so the like racial trauma, as I was writing it, I was writing it like right before everything started coming to a head for us here, like 2020, right? Obviously for me, it's been existing this whole time. I've been seeing, I've been seeing things that people are now seeing for the first time, right? Like for my whole life, but having it be out and everywhere and like bombarded and like, oh, you know, all of the trauma, actually fit into the divine timing of the healing, because I feel like the healing that I've put into this is going to help with the healing. Like my intention for little Black girls and little Black boys when they read it is that they remember who they really are, and whatever that means to who it, you know, that's my intention. Remember who you really are, but you only know who you really are. So that's
Yeah, that was beautiful. We can see little notifications from the chat. I always minimize the chat because I can't read other people's thoughts and focus on my amazing co-panelists at the same time. My brain will be like, oh, but every now and then we get a pop-up that's like beautiful, and I'm like, it was. Yeah, so there's been a lot of, we did a lot of discussion for my book, and we started this a little bit with my first book, Docile, which is also right there, but like many feet behind me, which is why you know, I choose to write a lot of a very explicit material, and a lot of my both my works, my books so far deal with like consent and agency a lot. So we're on the page in explicit detail for that. You know, that is something that I am interested in, like sort of navigating, not fade to black. I know lots of people do, but for me, you know, this is the sort of stuff where like, I'm not gonna give all my life details like out, you know, and this is where the conversation gets tricky, right? Because my experience with consent is, you know, that it's, I've had a complicated one with it, you know, not as a you know, perpetrator, as like as a person, you know, I'm queer and trans. I transitioned in my early 20s, so I went to college and high school, not out to myself yet, you know, and you know, lived very much as a teenage girl for a long time, I guess, through my teenage years. There is an exact time, actually. It's like 20.
for a long time. You're right, for a long time.
And you know, I've had a very sort of complicated relationship with that, and I wanted to convey that because I think that's, you know, I think a lot more people have, you know, they go into those relationships where, you know, you haven't learned what it means to give your enthusiastic consent to something, or you weren't taught to have specific kinds of interactions with people, you know, in bed. And like when we have such like sort of a lack of education, and we have, you know, rape culture perpetrating sort of everything, we don't always make the decisions that we wish. Like there's this, what do they call it, the after school special decisions, right? Like the sort of like in a romance novel, you would want folks enthusiastically saying yes to each other because they are enjoying the sex on the page for your titillation. But in my books, frequently, people are not sure what they're experiencing in the moment. And I really wanted a place to give voice to that sort of complication and nuance that lots of people have experienced, and to allow those characters to understand the ways in which they've been harmed through them over the course of the book. So, you know, I like to write hopeful endings, and part of that is me hoping that people like me also get hopeful endings, that even though you can go along, you know, being lied to your whole life and experiencing immense pain and abuse under the guise of something that may or may not be real, you know, to find things out, after a long time, and to be able to heal from that. Like, I just want that for other people. So, I put that hope into the end of my books on purpose. And I do, make my characters go through a lot because I want them to have that journey, just like, lots of people have experienced.
You are awesome.
So are you. So is Kerstin and Lee.
Thanks. You guys are great. With me, I think the heaviest scene in my novel, I sort of lean quite heavily on the fact that it's written in first person and I could use that as a tool. So in the most traumatic scene for the protagonist, I suggest she's dissociated from the situation by the way that she's describing what's happening. So I'm not really describing the action so much as her responses to, and what she's feeling in that moment. So for me, that was how I wanted to ethically handle that moment. Just to simultaneously convey, like, that can be how trauma works, but also to maybe not expose my potentially fragile reader to something quite horrific. So that's quite different from how Kellen did it, but I like that's kind of how I went about it.
I'm a big fan of the first person. I think it's super powerful, and I support you.
Yeah, it's haven't talked about that book much since I'm moderating, but writing in the third person makes you feel really responsible in a different way to the things you've done to the reader reading it. You're like, oh, I did that. That is not even separated. Sorry. But I did want to, since we're wrapping up soon, give some audience question time. And there is a really good one from Krista. I hope I pronounced your name right. That is kind of circling what we've been talking about. And they asked, ghosts, nightmares, cults, these are all also common in the horror genre. How do these elements of horror inform your work in a cathartic and trauma processing way? Can you speak to the interplay of horror and fantasy in processing trauma?
I'm like scared of horror, like in real life.
I'm just like,
I can't
need to go first.
I can't watch anything too scary. And it's funny because I have had things that I've written classified as horror before, and I'm like, okay, I'm glad that was scary for you, but like, I have to, for me, like, this isn't American Horror Story cults. There's not sort of a lot of the things that scare me. There are things that scare me on a there's different levels of horror and fear, right? There's psychological horror. I can't watch American Horror Story because there's a lot of creative body horror that will make me have to excuse myself. But I think that's sort of like for cults, it's more like the sort of psychological horror of being trapped and being lied to and gaslit and sort of like emotionally manipulated, which are horrors that lots of people experience all the time. So gosh, I lost the thread of the question. How do they inform your work in a cathartic or trauma processing way? Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's like the hope at the end of it is what makes it not horror. I think that horror, like, is that sort of leading you into dread, that feeling that you might not survive this. And for me, it's different in my work and is not horror because I want to sort of end with that healing and that sense of hope, that there's another chapter ahead for my characters.
I didn't really set out to write horror, but it keeps happening. So I'm just sort of leaning into it at this point. Like I technically write secondary world fantasy, but they tend to be quite strong horror elements, and I can only say that that's because I find them fun. Like, they obviously serve like a narrative purpose, but mostly I just derive enjoyment from making creepy, scary things. So that's why they're in my work.
I would say for my book, the horror is just, reality of that time. And how I guess I don't think of that as like horror genre, but it is horror. It is. And I think that how it informs my work is that I wanted to create a way to alchemize that, right? Alchemize that horror into something that, I mean, for me, it's, I don't want to tell the story. So I'm like,
You
but
gotta
basically
buy Anita's book, everyone.
buy it, go see how it's alchemized. But yeah.
I know I mentioned it already like 3 times because it's the first thing that pops into my head when people say the word horror, but like exactly what you just said, like I remember I want to be a person that enjoys horror because like it feels very smart and cool to me, and I'll read the Wikipedia plot. I'm just like, wow, that was a great movie. When the first season of American Horror Story came out, I got through it, between my fingers. It's like very sort of like it was more supernatural horror, which I have a better time with. And then I think the second season was Asylum, and I got halfway through and I had to stop because it made me nauseous, because I knew that those were real horrors that people were facing. It wasn't there's a ghost that's like popping up in my basement trying to murder me. It was like a gay woman is being kidnapped and tortured because she's a gay woman. And I was like, I can't not think of all the real people that this happened to while I'm watching this. And I had to stop, I think that is why I tend to sort of blend that's why I tend to do that blending in my work, where it's like, yes, sort of the emotional core of this is very real, but I'm going to couch it in things that feel more fantastic to me, because that's how I as a writer can get through it, right, without just being so overwhelmed that I can't produce.
Yeah, I think that also goes back to the question about feeling. Like if you are making the audience feel something, horror is a really affective genre, and that means the consumer is kind of the person who's making that feeling. So how connected you are to it is part of how intense it is. I love horror and was also the kid who was obsessed with death, and I've recommended things to people who are like, I'm a scaredy cat. And I'm like, no, this will be fine. And you get the text back that is like, why did you do that to me? No. And I think about that a lot in these conversations. There's another audience question. So we got like 5 more minutes. This should get us back to talk about your books some more, so everyone will buy them afterwards. And this is from Essa. It is, did you have an end goal in mind for the trauma your protagonist experience and process during the narrative, whether that's ultimately healing or a more complicated end state? I feel like we've circled that, and I think it's a great note to end on.
You want us to give away the end of our books. Kerstin, you're on, go.
Okay, I'll go. For me, I had a clear theme in mind writing the book, and that was that healing is not possible in the context of injustice. So in order for my protagonist to recover or not, I'm not telling you the end, from her particular traumas, she would either have to escape her situation or dismantle the situation that she finds herself in, because I don't think healing can really occur in situations where the hurt party is unsafe. So long as the as my protagonist remains stuck in her particular role, she cannot move forward. So for me, I was really trying to communicate that injustice and trauma and healing are all intrinsically linked. So that's
That's right. Very good. Um, yeah, I actually had no idea what the end was going to be. And it's very interesting because for me in storytelling, the end is the most important. That's for me. And I so it was really interesting. This is a good question because even within my process, I had no idea how she was going to process it and how the story was going to end. And I didn't receive the ending. I had a few different endings that I was like, this is not the ending, but I'm going to write it, right? Like, I'm like, let me write it so some kind of ending comes. And I didn't receive the ending until, and I'm not shitting you, probably like 2 days before I got my book deal. And I was like sitting there like, what the fuck is the ending? Yeah, man, yeah, like, because this is not it. Like people were liking it, but I'm like, mm-mm. And then it came and I was like, oh, everything makes sense now. And I'm like, was that ending there the whole time? I don't know. But yes. So, and that's for Shallow Waters. Get the book.
Yeah, pre-orders are so important, y'all. These two have these three, our moderator too, have books coming out. So please pre-order them. It's too late for me. No, I'm kidding. You can still buy my book. Congratulations. Oh, the ending, right. It's funny because I tend to know like the general arc. I was like, okay, the cult's liberated, and then Lark meets this cosplayer and they go on a road trip, and there's gonna be a monster fight. Like, but how does it end? That doesn't really answer the question, right? Because I'm a theme writer, so I care about the emotional ending the most. And when I'm deciding how it ends, what I ask is sort of, what do I want to leave the readers with? You know, how did it start? And what does my ending say about everything that's happened in the book? That's the most important to me. And, you know, my editor kept saying, do you know how it ends? Do you know how it ends? And I was like, ooh, ooh. My voice doesn't get any higher than that, but like, if it could, you know, I think I sort of mentioned this earlier, where it was like I'd read and seen so many pieces of like sort of fantasy fiction where somebody was processing their trauma through magic, and then at the end it was all not real, and to me that felt horrific, that I would sort of like take that away from my characters. But I also didn't want to validate an abusive cult leader, so I had to figure out how to do that in a way that felt, natural. And, you know, my characters spend almost the entire book healing. Like, it's mostly about processing trauma while you're on a very gay road trip. And so that like sort of final scene, that outro scene, I won't tell you what it is, but I feel like that was, for me, you know, the characters having that emotional ending and, you know, deciding what's real for themselves at the end of it all. And I'm really happy with it, and it, you know, brings me hope. So I hope that you all enjoy it too.
Thank you for those excellent answers. There were so many more really good questions in the chat, so I hope all of us get a chance to check them out afterwards. They were very good. Thank you to our audience, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you to the panelists. Yay. And the Center for Fiction folks, thank you too.
You all, thank you so much. Full heart. That was a beautiful, beautiful conversation. Lee, great questions. Helen, Anita, Kerstin, I wish you every success with your books. We put the links in the chat. I know people are frantically pre-ordering now and buying yours, and And I hope, like I said in the green room, I hope we all meet in real life at the Center for Fiction sometime soon. And until then, oh, and thanks to our fantastic audience too. It was a very warm room. So please join us again and cultivate your own magic in the meantime. So good night, everyone.